when I got this invitation about open source investigations in journally, I said before, it's kind of switched something in my mind that I've been thinking about for a while. So when I wanted to talk to you about today is, of course, open source investigations in journalism, but more specifically about what happens when we turn OSINV inward to look towards datafication platforms, AI systems themselves. So we know by now that open source investigations have become central for contemporary journalism, for conflict reporting, for investigative reporting at large. And of course, we associate these techniques with disasters, with remote context, with conflict scenarios, and in investigations that look outward and often also from above to territories, landscapes, to conflicts, etc. So, what I found out and also found extremely fascinating recently is what happened when we use the same methods to investigate machines, and in particular, data-driven machines, online platforms, AI system. And I think it's very interesting if we look at what journalism is doing by using OSINT inward to look into the machine, because I think that this also causes a shift in also in the politics of journalism, in the epistemology of journalism, in the kind of sources that become part of journalism and also accepted in the journalistic field. So also what we can consider evidence, what is witnessing, and also how we can bring through journalism accountability to technology, especially when technology are black boxes or opaque or difficult to look into. So uh, what you see here is a collection of images that I'm pretty sure you would associate with open source investigation. This one, for instance, is a satellite image that has been included in an investigation by the New York Times about the invasion of Ukraine and the movement of Russian troops on the ground. This one comes from Forensic Architecture and is part of their own incredible project titled The Cartography of Genocide, where they have been looking at multiple data sources and multiple evidence in form of data to kind of map events and also what is happening in Gaza and all the forces that have been used in that context and in the context of the genocide. This one instead comes from an investigation by The Intercept in Brazil, again, based on images from above, actually from quite high in the sky, using satellites to try to map landing spots on the territory to try investigate the routes that the drugs cartels or the movement of goods are been doing on the territory. And more kind of advanced or computation examples, for instance, you have this one from ProPublica, is now from a few years ago, is a project called High Hell and High Waters about what would happen in Houston if a storm of a certain strength would hit the city, how much the water will raise, how much the destruction would impact on the city. So also in this case, it's definitely a view from above. And of course, open source investigation rely exclusively on publicly accessible information. It can be social media posts, satellite imagery, we were saying, metadata related to this footage, platform signals, or even public records. It doesn't have to be necessarily images or videos or photographs. It can also be databases, information about pretty much anything that is out there. And of course, they don't rely on other kind of classic sourcing strategies of investigative journalism, like confidential documents, whistleblowers, show letter reporting, and anything that it's not out there publicly available. And open source investigation produce knowledge by collecting, verifying, contextualizing digital traces of various origins. And of course, the images, the data, the inputs are not evidenced by themselves. They become so, when they are put into a narrative, when they are like put together in a puzzle that then can also illuminate events or what is going on. So they become evidence through interpretation, I would say, by journalists. They ask where all of this come from, how it's circulated, and what they make visible or invisible by simply being there. And of course, this has been exceptionally useful for providing accountability from a distance, as we just seen through this example. And it's now the one of open source investigations, a central genre, I would say, or a central set of techniques and practices for contemporary reporting, especially, as we were saying, for conflict zone, disasters, or remote area. And of course, open source investigations, and this one, the image is one of the most famous works by Bellingcat, who have been able to trace the people responsible for the poisoning of Navalny by connecting the dots of various different data and information that was out there. They were even able to find out the phone numbers of these individuals and have Navalny call them. I mean, I'm sure you know the story. And of course, open source investigations excels when it comes to evidence production, transparency, and accountability. And all the organizations that I just simply mentioned, Bellingcat, Forensic Architecture, ProPublica, and all the others have shown how all of this can be mobilized to reconstruct events, to kind of bring contextualization to places and areas, to find out the perpetrators of specific crimes or specific events, and in particular build historical reconstruction of all of this. This is another example from Le Monde, who has been doing excellent work in this area, especially when it comes to police brutality or other events that happen in the streets or in the context of social and political tension. So this outward look of open source investigation is now kind of classic. It's now also very much a subject for research in journalism studies. But I always saw that less attention has been paid to how all of this can be used also in other contexts. And of course, it's not a critique to all of this, which is absolutely phenomenal. But I've always been asking myself, what happens when all of this is instead look at technological system that also generate and diffuse digital traces on the internet. So the point is that open source investigation creates knowledge by collecting, verifying, and interpreting digital traces, such as images, videos, metadata, and platform signals. And these traces become evidence, not on their own, but through careful contextualization by asking where they come from, how they circulate, and what they make visible or invisible. So open source investigation at the core, they turn fragments of digital activity into grounded form of knowing. So, as I said, I'm also a journalist, or at least I call myself also a journalist. And a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to do an interview with Eyal Weizman, who is the founder and director of Forensic Architecture, because the Italian translation of the book Investigative Aesthetics has just been published in Italy. So they were doing rounds of interview, and I jumped in. And while I was talking to him about the book, about the work of forensic architecture at large, he said the thing about what all of this means also in terms of understanding the technologies that are involved in open source investigations by themselves. And he said that you lift the hood and see how the engine is built, meaning like the digital tools and digital infrastructures that are usually used in the context of open source investigation, because you need to understand how it works in order to understand what it does. And any use of technology also requires introspection about that technology itself. This is part of critical culture. The tools we use, the means through which information reaches us, and he's talking about forensic architecture, the materiality of media, whatever form it takes, shape the outcome of our work. So technologies do not exist in a neutral context and do not operate from a view from nowhere. On the contrary, and I think this is crucial, they are highly situated practices. Only a critical reading of technology can produce an investigative illumination of the world. And this quote really put me into the thinking also for this talk. And I also immediately went back to this great book, which is titled Non-Human Witnessing by Michael Richardson, who does like lots of analysis into how data and ecology and environments at large participates into witnessing. And there is a chapter in the book about how algorithms by themselves can produce forms of witnessing. And if you include like technological actants like algorithms and machine into the process of witnessing, which is exactly what open source investigations do, this requires a rethinking of the idea of witnessing itself. And algorithms do not merely process information, but they actively shape what is generated, amplified, labeled, or hidden. And they function precisely as non-human witnesses in this sense. And the concept of machinic effects also help us understanding how AI systems can affect and be affected and how they participate in knowledge production without being neutral or transparent. And of course, opacity plays again a central role in this context because in many cases, all this digital infrastructure, AI systems, and algorithms in particular remain hidden even from their creators sometimes. And the opacity is sometimes not a bug, but a feature of our datafied society. So this is, of course, not new. It goes into Frank Pasquale and Bruno Latour work with black box technology. So I was kind of connecting the dots between all of this. And I was thinking that the forms of analysis that open source investigations apply to images and footage of events are increasingly being redirected also toward the data traces produced by computational systems. And Bruce Schneier, who is a leading expert in information security, has always argued that data is the byproduct of computation. And these byproducts can be also read as evidence. So the question is what happens when open source investigation methods are also applied to machine generated traces. And I mean the products of the machines themselves. So things like logs, metadata, algorithmic outputs, and when all of this is available, of course, openly out there on the internet. And of course, all of this can be used to allow journalism to investigate and make visible these operations of the data, of the AI systems, for instance, that would otherwise, in many cases, remain invisible. So the question I've been kind of obsessing myself with is what happens when open source investigations start looking inwards? What happens when we adapt the processes, the methods, the practices of open source investigation to look inside the machine and not only from above, from the sky, on kind of natural environments, but to the digital machines and infrastructures that we use every day. So open source investigations can definitely also function as a critical lens for observing data phenomena, let's call them this way, and to look inside the machine to things like platform infrastructures, data flows, algorithmic governance, data voids and data misuse, and to provide sometimes attribution, which is again a term that I take from information security, and find the perpetrators of things like disinformation campaigns, scam campaigns, and any kind of abuse and misuse of data and technology platform you can think of. And of course, this is already happening. And from now on, I will show you some example that I think show us what is possible to do in this way by using open source investigation to look into machines, data infrastructures, sorry, and the misuse of this technology. So let me just briefly highlight some examples that I selected with no particular methodology, but just because I think they are quite telling in this context. So this comes from the doppelganger investigations that has been led by the Insider, which is a opposition publication in Russia that has been like tracing this coordinated pro-Kremlin disinformation campaign, and they have been able to trace fake websites that were mimicking kind of genuine news outlet like The Spiegel, Fox News, etc. And all, of course, this was a coordinator disinformation campaign. So they've been like looking into these websites, the bot networks that were pushing this disinformation campaign, and how the cross-platform amplification took place. What's interesting here is that they were not only looking at the content published by all these fake websites, but also to the infrastructure, to the data traces that were out there, and they were able to map who was behind this, who was responsible for this, and now this network came to be. Another example, and this one comes from Craig Silverman, who is one of the leading experts in this area, is this work that he did in 2022 for ProPublica. At the time, he was working there, and he launched this investigation into Google's ad system and how it was actually used to place advertisement on piracy, scam websites, porn websites, and other like very dodgy websites on the internet, and how, for instance, the Google system in this case was able to make this website profitable by simply using Google's infrastructure. And in this case, they've been like doing some more advanced techniques, but computational techniques, I mean. But the interesting thing is that everything here was based on publicly available information. So they were matching, for instance, anonymized seller ID to real domains and apps. And they were again able to reconstruct these relationships between Google intermediaries and these problematic website. So it's kind of, if you want, an investigation into one of the most popular digital platforms out there for advertisement and digital marketing to show how it could also be misused for making this very kind of controversial and problematic website profitable. And I would argue that this system can also be a black box, so you can definitely see what the application here was. This other example comes from a quite interesting organization, which is AI Forensics, that has been specializing in using computational methods, OSINT, different practices and techniques to look into machines and open the black boxes, especially in relation to AI and algorithms of different kind. In this case, they focused on TikTok and how the app has been used to spread slopaganda, which is basically AI slop applied to propaganda purposes. This is kind of much more advanced than other data analysis technique. Again, but the investigation combined metadata analysis, automated monitoring to reveal large-scale AI-generated propaganda network, highlighting both the scale of AI content and the difficulty of accountability. So they partnered also with different news outlets across Europe. The most famous, the most prominent one has definitely been The Guardian, who focused in this case on the anti-immigration content that was circulating on TikTok, entirely AI generated and also pushed and amplified by automated fake accounts. They have been doing like widespread analysis also on the numbers and figures of the phenomenon to also see how moderation on TikTok sometimes was not efficient as the company was claiming, and all this kind of effect that were absolutely amplifying the spread of this propaganda AI generated content that was happening through, again, entirely automated fake accounts and with no accountability whatsoever. The other example I wanted to show instead also kind of is at the border in a sense between crime, cybercrime, and this kind of look into the machine. And it's the Mr. Deepfake investigation that has been conducted jointly by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Bellingcat, again, and two news outlets based in Denmark, like Tjek.det and Politiken this year. So it's quite fresh. In this case, OSINT investigation have been used to expose individuals hiding behind complex digital infrastructure. And Mr. Deepfake was a particularly horrible website that could be used to create non-consensual pornography, revenge porn, targeting women and girls. It was just out there, and perpetrators could use this website to create and distribute this kind of harassment-oriented deepfakes. And journalists were able to trace all these elements that were out there on the internet to find the people responsible for the website, back to the very top of the organization that was lately also arrested. And in this case, what's interesting, I think, is that this investigation brings together the digital realm, if you want, with the real one. So with real individuals, both perpetrators and victims. So they were able to trace the real infrastructure, the concrete infrastructure of how this Mr. Deepfake website was operating, and how the deepfakes, in this sense, were also distributed or circulating out there. So if you go back to how we define open source investigation in the opening, you may ask, well, yes, but these are digital investigations of different kind. Is data journalism, is computational journalism, or if you want, but what makes them actual open source investigation? Well, all of this, it's based on publicly available data. They have not like accessed training system for AI or training manuals of AI systems through Freedom of Information Access Law. There is no whistleblower providing unauthorized access to data or information. It's all made through social media posts, website, ad networks, forums, things that it's out there, just needs to be found and put into this journalistic narratives. And it's done through systematic collection and cross-references of all these digital traces. And it's done on the purpose of connecting accounts, domains, platforms, URLs, payment systems, everything that really can be used to create these maps and networks of what is happening, not only on the internet, but as we also seen with the Mr. Deepfake case, also with real person and real criminals. So in this case, OSINT techniques in particular make visible activities that would otherwise remain opaque, pretty much as a satellite image could illuminate a conflict zone. In this case, digital traces of machines themselves can be used to map this kind of networks, and I would also say crimes. This is an interesting article that I want at least mention. It has been published just yesterday, so didn't have the time to dig into it. But when it comes to open source investigations, AI, and all of this, we should also, of course, keep into account how artificial intelligence and the use of it to produce images and videos that are published on the internet also complicates the work of open source investigators and journalists at large. We are, of course, talking again about AI slop and the increasingly difficulties that most member of the audiences have to distinguish between fake and real footage out there, with the obvious consequences for information disorders. So to conclude and to give you also some takeaways from this provocation, I would argue that open source investigations are no longer only about events out there in the world, but they can also be used to interrogating data systems and AI infrastructure that also have very strong powers in the real world when it comes to shape visibility, power, and various forms of arms. Digital traces produced by machines, by digital infrastructure, can also function as evidence and allow journalists to hold algorithmic system accountable, but also the humans behind them similarly accountable. And in this case, all of this can also act as witnessing by itself, and open source investigation provides also the tools to make these operations legible as much as possible. And I think that ultimately, a critical reflexive approach to technology, like the one that these techniques show us when they are used inwards through the machine, are essential also for contemporary journalism by itself, because these tools that in this case are addressed are never neutral, but they also, as we of course know, actively shape what we are able to know, what we are able to see on the internet at increasingly out of it. As said, as a researcher, I haven't done yet much work in the area of open source investigations, but I would gladly point you to this book chapter that I've recently published in the Routledge Companion to Digital Journalism Studies, which has just been released. And if you're interested, of course, there's a preprint version that I published on my university open access repository. And in this case, I look at open source investigations as assemblages, and to show also how this kind of digital investigative journalism is usually performed in collaboration between very different kind of organizations and groups, starting from mainstream news outlet to amateurs and groups in between, like Bellingcat and forensic architecture, that sometimes mediate between the kind of, let's call it, professional journalism sphere and the audiences. And thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the conversation.